Pisnaxiokhu isquis Dina Gilio-Whitaker, and I greet you in my indigenous Insukchin language that we say from where I descend, which is the Sinaiks tribe of the Colville Confederated Tribes in Washington State. And so I'm here to talk to you about some of the work that I do. And before I do that, I also want to do something that we as indigenous people is a tradition, and we acknowledge the land that we're on, the ancestral land that we're on. We are on the unceded territory of the Ahashiman people, who are the original people to this place. And if there are any people here of Ahashiman ancestry, I acknowledge you, and I acknowledge the ancestors and the spirits whose space that we are in, who sit with us now. So what I do, as Steve said, I teach American Indian Studies at Cal State San Marcos. I also am a policy director at an organization called the Center for World Indigenous Studies. And so I'm steeped in the world of scholarship and around Indigenous and Native American studies. And I wrote a book that came out 2 years ago. It's my first book. I co-authored it with an amazing woman named Roxanne Dunbar-Ortiz, who's kind of a rock star in our field. And we wrote this book called All the Real Indians Died Off, and 20 Other Myths About Native Americans. And what the book does in 21 easily digestible chapters, it talks about kind of the myths and the stereotypes that construct some modern American narratives about American Indians, and creates all this misunderstanding and misnomers that makes Native people almost impossible to be perceived accurately in our society. So that's a lot of the work that I do is based around that, correcting those kinds of narratives. I have a new book coming out next year. It's called As Long as Grass Grows, The Indigenous Fight for Environmental Justice from Colonization to Standing Rock. Anybody here remember Standing Rock? Yep. Yeah, so this takes Standing Rock as the kind of the grounding example of what environmental injustice and justice looks like for American Indian people. That comes out next April. And then I contributed to this book. Anybody seen this book? Anybody know this, The Critical Surf Studies Reader? It's the first book of its kind. It came out last year. It's an academic anthology, so it's a collection of essays that are written by scholars who are doing work in what we are calling critical surf studies. So they come from many different disciplines. And they're looking at surfing from a whole lot of different angles, and particularly critical. So, we have people doing surf feminism, like Krista Comer and Elizabeth that Steve was mentioning, who will be here next month, bringing in these feminist perspectives to surfing. We've got a whole lot of different perspectives that people are writing and correcting histories. And that's a lot of what I do in this work, and my chapter in this book is about that. So I'm intersecting these different kinds of studies between Indigenous studies and surf studies, and that's what I'm going to talk to you about tonight. A little bit about me. I do surf. I do have some cred, some surf cred. I started surfing a long, long time ago, 38 years ago. I started learning to surf, I started body surfing the beaches of Santa Monica as a kid. And then I moved to Hawaii in 1980, moved to the North Shore, started surfing, met my husband, Tom Whitaker, married him 26 years later, and didn't surf for 25 years, and then got back into it later in life, and made the switch to stand-up paddle surfing. So I kind of, yeah. Yay, thanks for, half the people I know here, thanks for coming. It's so awesome to have the support.
I love surfing with you, Dean.
Yeah. Okay, so to the title of this talk, Indians in Unexpected Places, it's not original, okay? I took it from the title of this book. It's one of the most important books in our field by a man named Phil Deloria, and he wrote this book called Indians in Unexpected Places, and what he does in this book is he looks at the history of how Native people have been, going back to this idea of stereotypes and misperceptions and misconceptions about who Native people are in American society, and how Native people show up in places that they don't expect to be seen. And so they're like, and it comes down to this idea that Indians cannot be seen as modern people, right? Indians are stuck in a frozen past. They wear buckskins and feathers. They live in teepees. They're frozen in this time warp, and they can't move forward in ways that make them able to live in like everybody else, like in the modern world. And so, Phil Deloria, love his work. Gotta cite the title. So what I'm going to do is I'm going to tell you two different stories. Okay, I'm going to bring together two different stories in ways that you've probably never heard before, and it's going to be the story of surf history, and it's going to be the story of of American Indians, especially in this area, and what the two have to do with each other, because they have a lot to do with each other. So first of all, we're gonna go into the little bit of history of surf culture. But I want to start with a quick little quiz, because I know we have some surf historians in the audience. So I'm going to ask you a few questions, and we'll see where it goes. So I'm going to ask you, when does surfing first appear in California? You can just blurt it out. Who knows?
George Freeth.
Okay, so give me a date and say when.
Turn of the century,
1917.
Okay, it's all over the place. Okay, so most people think it starts with George Freeth. Is that true? Is there any other, can you think of any other incident?
Anecdotal incidents.
Okay.
Chumash Indians.
Okay, here's the real answer. Surfing first appears in 1883 in Santa Cruz. Who knows that history of the three Hawaiian princes? Okay, so three Hawaiian princes are attending military school in San Mateo, and one day they show up to Santa Cruz, a hot summer July day. It's sweltering hot, and they just show up out of nowhere with these massive handmade redwood boards, and they surf, and nobody's ever seen anything like it. And it draws this big crowd, and it's like, oh my God, and then they go away and they're never seen again. And so that's known as the three princes. And now there's at Steamer Lane, right? That happens at Steamer Lane, and now there's a museum there at Steamer Lane that commemorates this history, and it's a surfing history museum. And there's a special plaque with the three princes. So that's the official answer to that question. Okay, next question. When does surfing arrive to Southern California? Okay, so that's right. George Freeth in 1907. Okay, 1907, George Freeth. But see, when the Hawaiian princes came to Santa Cruz, it was there, it's documented, but it doesn't stick, right? Surfing doesn't stick. It sticks after George Freeth shows up in 1907, and we're going to talk a little bit more about that later. This is a little more advanced question. Why is George Freeth here, and who hires him to give surfing demonstrations? Okay, now? Okay. So the answer is Abbott Kinney, okay? Abbott Kinney is the developer of Venice Beach, and Henry Huntington. Henry Huntington develops Redondo Beach. These guys hired George Freeth to give surfing demonstrations, and that's what I'm going to talk about more a little bit later, okay? So we're going to hold that thought.
Who is George Freeth?
George Freeth is a Hapahali Hawaiian guy. Okay, he comes from Hawaii, and he actually. Well, I'm going to talk about him in just a minute. So we're getting there to the next slide. So turn of the century. This is what Southern California beaches looks like. You can see this is the Venice Pier, 1907. You see Abbott Kinney here, who develops this, Venice. And then here you see Venice Beach, and there's no date, but this appears to be the Victorian era based on the clothes. So there's this massive boardwalk, and you can see these massive homes, but it's not populated, right? The beach areas are not populated at the turn of the century, not like we have here. People didn't live at the beach, right, at the turn of the century. But so you go down here to Hermosa Beach in the 1920s, you can see it starting to build up. But look at all this empty land back here. That's what the beach areas looked like, right? People didn't live at the beach. Where did they live? They lived in LA, right? LA is like the center. That's where people had been living for centuries there, okay? So back to George Freeth. So George Freeth is he's this Hapahali Hawaiian guy. And what he does, he's known for a lot of things, but in Hawaii, he's really known for reviving stand-up board surfing in Waikiki, right? There's a whole history about this that's really contested. That some of the work that I do is unpacking that. But the narratives are that that surfing is a dying sport, and white people, namely Alexander Hume Ford, and Jack London revive it, right? They save surfing because Hawaiians let it languish. It's not true, but that's the narrative that gets developed. And but George Freeth does single-handedly revive the art of standing up and riding a board in the Waikiki area. It was still happening throughout the islands, but in Waikiki, it's George Freeth that revives it. And then when he gets to Southern California in 1907, he single-handedly invents the art of lifeguarding. Okay, and so lifeguarding because there's lifeguarding, and at the same time there's this push to there's these public plunges are being built, these public pools, and so the combination of these two things make the ocean safe for people to go in, right? So it becomes a place that because people didn't go in the ocean before that. It was too unsafe, it was too scary, people didn't swim. So now they're learning how to swim, we have lifeguarding, and people are becoming lifeguards, and now we have the opening, the space for surfing to be available to everybody. And then Duke Kahanamoku comes along. Anybody know the relationship between Duke Kahanamoku and George Freeth? So Duke Kahanamoku, we know him he's known as the father of modern surfing. But the fact is, George Freeth was the teacher of Duke Kahanamoku. He was a swimming teacher back in Honolulu, and so Duke goes on. He joins. What's he famous for early on?
The Olympic swimmer.
Right. So in the beginning, he's a 3-time Olympian. Right. He goes 1912. He wins a gold medal. And then in 1920 he wins more medals, and then in 1924 he wins more medals. So he's an Olympian. And coincidentally, as an aside, 1912 was a big year for Native people because that's the year that a famous Native American wins the pentathlon and decathlon. Who is that?
Jim Thorpe.
Right. So Jim Thorpe and Duke Kahanamoku are these Native people, and there's also a black athlete who makes a big splash, whose name I don't remember, but it's a big year for people of color in the Olympics. So Duke Kahanamoku becomes known as the father of modern surfing, and I think that but yet it's really George Freeth who does more to bring surfing he brought surfing to California. So he's the reason we have surfing here. But George Freeth died in 1918. He died as a result of the Spanish influenza outbreak. And he was living in San Diego, and he dies in San Diego. Like millions of people in the world died in that epidemic that year. So Duke Kahanamoku he has longevity, and then he's the guy that brings surfing to Australia. So he becomes the guy that becomes really famous, and George is sort of left in the dust of history. So we have the beginnings. This is the foundation of surf culture in California. San Onofre is, quote unquote, discovered in the 1930s. Who does that? Who discovers San Onofre? Steve, you should know this. Bob? No?
No.
Whitey Harrison?
Yeah.
And a few others. I'm not, that. So there's some people who are known, like within, surf history, as finding San Onofre, and San Onofre really, surf culture really gets rooted in San Onofre because it's this big open space. People can go down there and camp. They can live for weeks at a time. They are getting lobster, they get fish, they get abalone, they get all this. They can just live off the ocean, off the land, and there's no real restrictions. So it becomes the sort of the ground for surf culture until the days of the Malibu crew, right? So Fred Corner writes this. Is that his name, right? Yeah. Gidget's dad. He writes. Fred Corner writes this book about his daughter in 1958, and it becomes a sensation. Within 2 years, the book's made into a movie, and the Gidget movie gives birth to an entire genre of Hollywood films that we call the beach blanket films. And surf culture explodes in Southern California. And it sort of shifts to Malibu. Malibu becomes ground zero for surf culture, even though it's still happening down here in San Onofre. Malibu becomes the focal point for surf culture. So then what happens? We have the creation of Endless Summer. And Endless Summer is made in, 60? I think it's like it's a mid-60s, I can't remember. Yeah, it's the mid-60s. And that becomes known as sort of like the first, like Bruce Brown is like the first real surf filmmaker, right? Because those other ones don't count. That's not real surf culture. Gidget, Beach Blanket Bingo, Rod the World Surf, all those films, it's not real surf culture, and all the surfers knew it. And so it becomes, so it gives birth to this whole other genre of surf films that are like authentic. It's authentic surf culture. It's real surfers. It's surfers going to see these movies, and so another level of explosion happens with surf culture. Robert August. You see these guys here. That's from the film, and then you have the Beach Boys, but the Beach Boys are posers, right? That's not real surf music. So there's it's all mixed up. Like you have some real surfing and some kind of like Hollywood surfing, and I mean they didn't even surf, but the music was great. I mean it animated our lives growing up in Southern California. It's okay. So surf culture's born. I mean, it's here. It's rooted. It ain't going anywhere. And now we have an industry, in fact. Okay, so I'm going to tell the second story. Okay, the second story we're going to talk about California Indian history, and we're going to do another history quiz. Okay. This is going to be probably a little more challenging. Okay. How long have indigenous people been in California?
3,000.
Okay, here, I'm going to ask, who thinks they've been here for between 1 and 6,000 years? Hands. Okay. How about between 6,000 and 10,000 years?
Absolutely.
Okay. Longer than 10,000 years? Good, I'm impressed. Yes, very good. Yes. The answer is that they've been here at least 10,000 years, okay? And that's a conservative estimate because we know that here at Pondhay, they've been here, it's verified, at least 9,600 years. And probably a lot longer than that, probably. Probably closer, I mean, archaeology keeps coming up with findings, right? And it's happening faster and faster that pushes the date back where they can absolutely prove that Native people have been on the continent for 12,000, probably over 15,000 years. So, okay. How long have non-Indigenous people been in Southern California? What? 800? 200, okay. 249 years. Because the first Spanish establishment happens in, the Spanish they come from what was, now Mexico was then Spain. They come up here and the first settlement happens in what they called Alta California in 1769. So this is almost 250 years. So here's a way to look at that. If we're to compare the length of time that non-Indigenous people have been here compared to what Indigenous people have been here, if we were to map it out on a calendar, if 10,000 years is one calendar year, non-Indigenous people have been here 9 days. Okay, that's 2%. Okay, so non-Indigenous people have been here 2% of the time that we know that Indigenous people have been here. So that's a little perspective for you. How many Indians were here in California pre-contact?
Oh. 7 million.
So the numbers really vary. It's really impossible to know, but the numbers really vary. There are at least 300,000 and upwards of 1 million people. And it makes sense because the life, the biological life that was here was incredible. Right? It was rich. This place was, there were grizzly bears here. Grizzly bears here. And incredible wildlife that's, long extinct now, but the land provided, and so it was able to support, relatively large populations of people. To give you an example, or to give you some more perspective, this is a map that shows, so the Tongva Nation are the original people of what we call Los Angeles now. And this map, if you look in the background, you'll see the popular names that we all grew up knowing, but that it's transposed on top of those places with Indigenous place names. So you can see just in LA, this is just, and this is not even complete. I know that there are more places on this map that people lived and had names for that aren't there. And some of those names still survive on places like Topanga Canyon, that's a Tongva name. Cahuenga, that's a Tongva name. Tahunga, that's a Tongva name also. So it's woven into the landscape and the place names that we know now. So this just kind of shows you that Native people were here. This was a thickly populated place for a very, very long time. So what happens? So if non-Native people have only been here for 249 years, 9 days, how does it go? How do we get from a completely indigenous populated place to very few Native people living there? Okay. So first, the very brief history: Spanish mission period, 1769 to 1821. The missions are built. The missions are built with Indian labor. They're enslaved, basically. They're not well taken care of, contrary to the myths that we were all told as children, building those fourth grade mission projects. Native people are forced into the missions. They are forced to build these buildings, and so it's basically a system of slavery, and they die in mass numbers because of diseases and overwork. Okay. So the Spanish controlled the entire coastal area, and what happens, because they control the coastline, it pushes the native people inland. So even though the native people revolted, and there were some very violent revolutions coming out of those missions, they get pushed inland. So the Kumeyaay people, the Cupeño, the Tongvas, and the Yahashiman and others, they get pushed off their beachfront, their coastal lands. Okay, so all of these places, all along the coast, were all inhabited places, thickly inhabited places that have deep histories. There's burials, there's sacred sites of all kinds that are still here. But they get pushed inland, and that's why you have, what reservations we do have. There's 18 reservations in San Diego County, more than any other county in the United States. And the reason that they're inland is because of this history. But the Kumeyaay were ocean-based people. Okay. The Mexican period between 1821 and 1848, the missions are secularized, the priests are kicked out, and the Mexicans start giving, the Mexican government starts granting land to Mexican elites. They grant large tracts of land, and it creates these massive ranchos that we are familiar with the names of: Rancho Mission Viejo, Rancho San Clemente. I mean, so all the names of the ranchos are places, they descend from this history of Spanish control of the land. Indians, what happens to Indians? Indians go to work. The ones that are surviving, right, because they're not all dying, they're still around, they become employed on these ranchos. So in the American period begins about 1846 with the Mexican-American War. The Treaty of Guadalupe Hidalgo is signed in 1846, maybe 1848. And then the gold rush is happening at the same time. So you see massive influx of people coming from the East Coast. They're coming from everywhere to cash in. And it brings on this period of incredible violence to the indigenous population, to push them off their lands. Everywhere in the north, not just in the north where the gold is being found, but everywhere. And this system of forced labor is still going on. So the slavery didn't end with the Spanish missions. It continues in the American period. And so 1850, California becomes a state. In 1851, Governor Peter Burnett declares a war of extinction on the indigenous population. He says it in his State of the State address. It's a war of extinction on the indigenous population. Like, we're not even gonna try to sugarcoat that one. That's just what's going to happen. And the laws are created to make it legal to murder Indians, and it does it in a lot of different ways. And the way that they do it, they don't have a standing army, but it becomes it gets deployed through citizen militias, and it gets funded by the federal government. So in the words of Brandon Lindsay, a scholar who writes about California genocide, he says that it's these bands of roving murderers, basically, that are going around just killing. And maybe people could make money at it. They paid bounties for Indian heads. That's how it was a way for people to earn money and to earn a living, was to hunt Indians, and so it was perfectly legal to do that. In San Diego, there's histories, documented histories about Indians being hunted for sport. People, in downtown San Diego, you could shoot an Indian as a matter of sport. So, and so what happens is that Native people, so this California Indian land law gets passed while this incredible carnage is going on. And the law is designed to defraud the Mexicans, because who still owns the land? It's still the Mexicans, right? Spanish-descended Mexicans who own the land. But now it's under American control. And so the California Land Act gets passed in 1951, and it's designed to defraud the Mexicans out of the land in a whole lot of different ways, and it's very effective. Here in Orange County alone, you see, and I did this study to trace it, to find out just how long it took for all that land to fall into white settler ownership. And it was a matter of about 38 years. So in Orange County, what used to be owned by all Mexican and Spanish people falls into the hands of white settlers who are flocking from the East Coast. And so by the 1880s, it's all, none of it's owned by Mexicans anymore. It's all owned by non-native people, specifically white people. So this process becomes a process of erasure of indigenous people. And the system of legalized slavery, it lasts well into the turn of the century. And it's carried out in a whole lot of different ways, and it's perfectly legal for Native people to be in bondage. And so what it means is, for the Native people that have survived, is that they've gone into hiding because it becomes illegal to be an Indian. Because it's legal to be murdered if you're an Indian, you survive. And so, well, how do you do that? You survive by going underground, by assuming different identities, by saying that you're Mexican, or by saying that you're some other race, because if you're Indian, it gets you killed. So that's one of the ways that, one of the reasons there's so much confusion about who Indian people are in California has persisted. The United States, meanwhile, has made 18 treaties with the tribes all over the state. The treaty negotiators go back to Washington, D.C. The Senate refuses to ratify those treaties. Those treaties get literally locked away in a drawer and forgotten about for 40 years. Somebody discovers them one day. Oh my God, we made treaties with the Indians in California. But by then the land's all gone, it's all taken. So they're basically defrauded out of all of their land, or almost all of their land. So it becomes massive land theft. So even though they're almost completely dispossessed of their lands, and they've assumed new identities, their cultures are still going. They're still keeping them going, and underground. They're keeping them quiet. They're holding on in whatever ways they can. But what happens to California history? What did we all grow up with? We grew up with these romanticized narratives of missions and rugged settlers, gold explorers coming, looking to find their way, and they're looked at and they're venerated, right? They're looked at in this positive way, but it's this romanticized history. And Indians are left behind in the dustbin of history. They can't be modern, existing people, and they are reduced to the margins of pre-American history. And studies, there have been formal studies that actually demonstrate that the way Indian history is taught in this country at the K through 12 level is overwhelming overwhelmingly represents them in this pre-1900 frozen past. So, so that's like not even debatable. That's just how history is being taught. Okay, so now we're going to bring these two things together. Bring these two very different stories together. So, 1907, George Freeth comes to California, and he's hired to give these demonstrations by these land developers who have only recently come into possession of the land, right? 1907. So the land, by the 1880s, is when the land has become owned by white people, okay? And so they've only owned it really for a few years, but they've bought huge tracts of it, and their goal is to sell land. They're land developers. And so they bring George Freeth there, to give surfing demonstrations to attract people to buy beachfront property, in order to create a beach-centered lifestyle. So it's completely manufactured. It was a marketing scheme, in fact. So yeah, so because like you saw in some of the earlier pictures, people did not live at the beach. They needed to figure out a way to get people to move to the beach and create this beach-centered lifestyle, and George Freeth is the guy that makes it happen for them. Yeah, so the pools, the lifeguarding, the ocean is now safe for swimming, and beachfront property is now desirable for people to come and buy. So, do Indians surf? Well, we don't know. We don't know about here. There's not any documentation to show whether or not Native Americans here surfed. There's reason to believe they probably did if we look at the history of these people. Anybody know who this is?
Peru.
Yeah, who are those people? What's that place?
One chuckle.
Yeah, it says it right there, right? So
See that?
So it's a world
Yeah, Brian,
heritage
sure.
site. It's a World Surf Heritage Site. It's one of the 10 places in the world with this designation. These indigenous Peruvians, they're called the Chimu and Mochica people have been surfing on these reed boats called the Caballito de Totora for 3,500 years.
Suppers.
So 3,500 years. This is like documented history. Like these guys have been riding these reed boats. The original suppers for 3,500 years, and they still ride them. I mean, they still ride these things.
For recreation only?
Well, no. The history started because the speculation is that because they're a fishing culture. And so these are fishing vessels. So if you take these boats and you're standing up or sitting down or whatever, riding these one-man vessels, you have to go out through the surf to go fishing, but you got to come back in, which means you're going to have to learn how to ride waves, right?
I didn't think it was just recreation, but yeah.
Yeah, no. So it's like utilitarian, but probably it was fun, right? Once you knew what you were doing, so that's even further back than the Polynesian history of surfing, but it's different. It's different. But look at the difference or the similarities. These are Thule reed boats, these Caballito de Totora, and these are the vessels that the Indians around here made and fished in. And so you can see the different styles. This one right here. This is the Blas Aguilar in San Juan Capistrano. It's like a replica of one of the boats. I don't know what the names of these vessels are, but they used them for fishing because they're ocean-based people. They're fishermen. This is what Siquan, the style of Siquan down south. That's their style of boat. This is Pomo up in Northern California. But you can see how the styles are so similar. And it's hard for me not to believe that they were probably riding waves in those things on some level. Okay, so now, so I'm kind of bringing it back to, you know, how Native people interact with surf culture now. I happen to work with this group. This is a group that's called Native Like Water. It's run by a Native guy who's been doing this program for 18 years. And what he does is he brings these kids, all Native kids, and they come from all over the country. But most of them, well, yeah, probably most of them they're Kumeyaay, they're from around here, they're from San Diego, they're Kumeyaay, they're Cupeños, they're other kinds of Native people from close by, but they've also come from Hawaii, I've worked with kids in this program from Wisconsin and Minnesota. So they come from all over the country to come to this program, and what this program does is it steeps them in indigenous culture, and it happens at UC San Diego. So for 11 days, these kids are staying in dorms in a university, in a college prep environment. They are doing academic work. They're creating films. They're doing all kinds of things, and we teach them to surf. So for a lot of these kids, it's an exposure to the ocean for the first time, but for some of them, so what we're doing is we're indigenizing education for them. But for some of these kids, let's see, I'm not going to show that film. But what happens is for a lot of these kids, it's the reconnection to their ancient ocean-based cultures. Like for the Kumeyaay kids especially, because like I said, the Kumeyaay used to be based here. They were oceanfront people, fishing people that got pushed inland. So they're coming to this program and they're getting re-exposed. They're reinvigorating these their ancient ocean-based cultures, and so it's against this backdrop of this really violent history, this violent dispossession that's always in their face, right? So they come to the coastal areas where there's nothing but development. There's sacred sites, their burials are being dug up every single day. I heard an astounding. I was lecturing this class that I teach at San Marcos. It's a class on environmental issues, and I had a guest speaker in the class, and the guy is a cultural monitor. He's the guy that whenever there's some new development that's being built, he's the guy that comes, and it's common everywhere. Anytime there's some new project being built, they have a cultural monitor come out to oversee in case they dig up burials, because it happens all the time. And he said that they're losing sacred sites at the rate of 10 per day. So 10 per day, native sites are being, either burials or other ancient implements are being found. So that's what these people live with every day, knowing that their ancestors are being dug up. There's no law to stop it. So this is what these kids are living with, and when they come to these places, especially here on the coast. And so some of the factors that are complicating factors for them is this trauma, this historic trauma that they're living in. And so some of the studies about historic trauma are making it more and more clear that certain groups of people inherit trauma. People who are Holocaust survivors, for example, are known to inherit trauma. It's passed down what they call epigenetically. So it's in your genes. There's all this evidence that people who were born into these violent histories inherit this trauma. Sacred sites are lost 10 per day in coastal Southern California. Estimates are that in Orange County alone, 90% of sacred sites are gone because of development. So Ponhe would have been one of them. Pawnee, well, Pawnee is largely, it's been disrupted, right? Pawnee's been disrupted, but at least part of Pawnee is still there and still protected. So, anybody know who this guy is? Anybody ever hear of Johnny Rice? So Johnny Rice is this guy who, he's probably the most well-known American Indian surfer in surf culture and surf history. He's Citizen Potawatomi, that's the name of his tribe, and he was born in Santa Cruz and grew up in Santa Cruz. But when he was a kid, his father was a full-blood Native. His mother was white. And but he was born at a time where people didn't talk about being Native. It was really common for people not to admit to their Native heritage, and they often lied about who they were because the discrimination was pretty intense, and that was the environment that he grew up in. So his family moved to Southern California, and he grew up like in Manhattan Beach in the 40s. And he became part of the Malibu crew in the 40s and 50s. He was mentored by Dale Velzy. Dale Velzy taught him how to shape boards, and so he became really good at it. He was a really good surfer. He ends up moving back to Santa Cruz, and he becomes known as the grandfather of surfing in Santa Cruz. And so I want to share with you this film, this quick film, and it shows how he brings an indigenous sensibility as a Native American. He brings his the kind of the culture. He blends Native American culture with surf culture in a really interesting way. I'm gonna get this. So I showed that to you because Johnny, he only touches on it for a minute. But he talks about, surfing being, he relates it to the four directions. That's an indigenous concept, right? North, south, east, and west. And all of those concepts equate to, different aspects of what it means to be human. And so he brings that to surfing in this beautiful way. And he became a sun dancer. He had a problem with drugs and alcohol. He became a sun dancer. It brought him back into his culture, and that's what heals him. Between that and surfing. And so for him it was like the seamless blending of beautiful elements. So why does any of this matter? I'm gonna wrap this up. But why does any of this matter? Like, why are we talking about any of this? So what we're doing is we're correcting history here, okay? So these romanticized histories about, romantic, beautiful California missions and rugged gold rush seekers, those things we know are wrong, right? There's this concealed history that needs to be told, and it's the backdrop against all of us, against which we all live. It's the backdrop against which surf culture has been formed, and so we want to reverse that and start, being honest about the society that we live in and the place that we live in. So that California Native people can be seen not as just existing. Yeah, California Indians are still here, but they're vibrant. Their cultures are still relevant, and they're still they're revitalized. Right? This is what Panhe, our Panhe celebration is all about. Is about celebrating the fact that Native people are here and these histories are still here. They're still being celebrated. They're still relevant. So we're unerasing these histories. We're unerasing Indigenous peoples in their spaces. And as communities with unique rights, they help provide, because they're Native peoples, we have laws we have federal laws and we have state laws that protect what little remains of Indigenous tribal cultural, we call them tribal cultural resources. That's sort of a legal term. But one of the reasons, for example, is that Panhe was able to be saved, right? Why the Coastal Commission denied the permit for the toll road was not just because of the endangerment to the environment, but it had a lot to do with the fact that Panhe was an American Indian sacred site. Okay, So there was a level of legal protection, but people didn't know that. It was one of those things that was sort of swept under the rug in a way, while the environmentalists and the surfers, praised, the protecting of the environment. It was there was great weight on the fact that there was a Native American sacred site that needed protecting. So we have some recent developments in the state. The Coastal Commission has been a real champion in advancing Indigenous rights, and they just recently, this month, they finalized their tribal consultation policy, which will give greater strength to the laws that already do exist to protect some of these coastal environments and protect sacred sites. They are also working on a draft environmental justice policy, which is amended, which based on, it's this law called AB 2616 that was passed in 2016, just 2 years ago, that amends the Coastal Act to mandate an environmental justice policy framework. And within that framework is an Indigenous and Native American environmental justice framework that will be separate, because they recognize that Native sites are distinct. They need distinct types of protections, and so environmental justice for Native peoples is different for everybody else. That's sort of the bottom line about that. And then just this week, anybody hear about this? Surfing this past was the State's Board of California. So yeah, so this bill, it's cool, right? We get surfing as the State's Board of California, but there's another concealed piece of this that's not being really talked about, is the fact that this bill has language written into it that begins by recognizing surfing as an Indigenous sport that emerges from Polynesia, and that it's a sport that takes place in Indigenous homelands, and it names some of our well-known surf spots like Trestles and Huntington Beach and Steamer Lane, but it also gives the Indigenous name places. The bill names these places, and it also includes the names of the original peoples of this homeland. So this bill really goes a long way to doing this work of unerasing Native people in their homelands. And so it's awesome. Yeah, it gives one hope, for people like me who are doing this kind of work, who know these histories. Finally there's some respect happening, and I was part of this crafting of this bill. In fact, I wrote the language of that and the Indigenous part, and fortunately there was no pushback. I was surprised, but
yay, Tina, right on.
we lobbied the legislators, Maritsuchi and Calderon, and there was a handful of people who worked on it, and they were gracious, and it was really a wonderful process. So I'm super stoked about that. That's the end of my presentation. So I do consulting. I do environmental justice consulting for Native people with different kinds of organizations, nonprofits, environmental organizations, other non-governmental organizations and schools. I'm available to come talk to your group and do trainings for your staff. That's what that little plug is. So that's my talk. And if you got any questions and you got any energy left, we can talk. That's probably